Yeah, so maybe like going with this openness, right? And sort of evaluating like what type of ideas and notions are we talking about. So earlier in the conversation, you already mentioned the notion interconnectedness, right? That played a important role. And maybe to try to get a grasp on that notion, right? You also talk about what sort of the primary unit in society, right? And obviously, again, like sort of, you know, the Western philosophy here takes the individual to be the primary unit, but you stress or highlight, right, that, you know, in Eastern philosophy, the family could be regarded as fundamental, right? So again, here it's like, how do we sort of evaluate that difference, right? And then secondly, how does that evaluation help us reevaluate the notion of interconnectedness that might help us, you know, with climate challenges?
Yes, right. Okay. Um, I mean, I think to start at an even broader level than the family, from the Chinese perspective, our Western idea, especially our idea about politics and society, that um, what you have is individuals, sort of atomic individuals, separate, autonomous individuals, separate from each other, independent of almost everything, and that they somehow come together in a social contract and agree will give up certain freedoms for the benefit of security that the state will provide. And so this is Hobbes, this is Locke, this is Rousseau, and so on. Now, from the Chinese perspective, that's completely backwards. That ontologically, as far as what there is and what's primary, they start at the other end and say what's primary, where we need to start, is the interconnected whole that is the world. Because we are, after all of us, in a world or the world. And we're appreciating more and more after globalization, which has brought us some benefits, but also a lot of real problems. That it is interconnected, and so the Chinese say that's where you start because that's what's basic. The individual, they would say, is an abstraction. For, something, a concept, a thought. It's not really real. It's an abstraction from the flux of interconnected experience, and so they would focus on the family by saying, okay, me as an individual, who am I? Well, I come into the world related to a biological father and mother, or even if I'm adopted, I have an adopted family, and I am the son of those of those parents. And when I get older, if I have a family of my own, I'm the parent of these different children, and so on. And so, who I am depends on this network of interrelations, which are social, political, and so on. It's all sort of layered, and it all is in the context of the natural world as well, because that's the only way we function. As long as we're on the earth, that's how we function. So when the Chinese say, okay, the smallest manageable unit that it's sensible to discuss is the family, and that's interesting because they see, as Plato did, incidentally, they see the individual as multiple, as a configuration of desires and drives and so on and so forth. But the family, you see it concretely writ large because you have two parents usually, and children and grandparents and grandchildren and so on. And so, what's helpful about the family is that relations there are based on love. I mean, I'm talking about the functional family, not the dysfunctional family of which we see so many these days. But when a family is working well, I think I gave the example. If my daughter is in trouble, I help her. I help her because she's my daughter, not because I've gone through some calculus morally about, well, what's the ethical thing to do, or what does a good father do, or whatever. And the Chinese have I think, a good way of thinking about society when they say, well, just extend that love that you naturally feel for your closest, for your nearest and dearest, out to farther relatives more distant, and eventually to the society and to your to the human family. In some sense, there is a human family. In fact, the Chinese word for the nation is country family. It's the family that's as large as the country. And so, of course, there are there are downsides to it. There's nepotism and so on. But if you can extend that feeling that obtains between members of the well-functioning family to others, it seems a very sensible way to go about things. And it's, if you say, okay, well, wait, no, the individual works just fine. Well, try solitary confinement for a few years. It's pretty hard. I think Aristotle was right when he said, the human being is a social animal and also a political animal, that we don't really function so well. We're not fully human unless we're in relationship with others.
And so one thought that comes to mind is also when you think, so I always wonder with this type of question, right? Like, in what sense do you have to take something as fundamental? In what sense can you be sort of like pluralist, where you say, well, my identity consists of, me being an individual? Then we can even say, well, even that is sort of pluralistic because, there's different parts of my psyche that, wants different things, right? In what sense is that a viable approach? Do you think that, there's sort of this synergy that can happen that can be sort of a coherent philosophy as such?
Yeah, I mean, that's an important issue, because I think that when we don't think about it too much, the man or woman in the street, still in the Western street at least, still has this Cartesian idea that we are basically individuals. That's what's most real, and we can work out from there. But if you think about it, if you think, how do we understand that on the biological, physiological level? Well, of course, we're not autonomous and independent. We are constantly exchanging the air in our lungs with the air outside, the moisture outside, the water outside, and the moisture of the body, and taking in nutriments and so on. That we are, as bodies, again, we're multiple. The body has so many different functions that work quite aside from the single I that I might think might control them. It's just as well I don't have to control the secretions from the pancreas and so on. I'd be dead within minutes if I had to do that consciously. But the body is related then intimately to nature, has evolved, unless you deny the theory of evolution, has evolved over hundreds of thousands of years in the natural environment, in the environment of the natural world, and is completely not independent of it, but interdependent with it. And the insanity of we're destroying, because we haven't mentioned biodiversity and all the things in the natural world we're destroying the very basis on which the natural resources on which we depend for our very survival. And again, we seem not to be too concerned about that. Because it's very seductive, that idea of I'm a mind. Because if I have an armchair and I lay back and I engage in some abstract thinking, I can feel as if I don't have a body. But the Cartesians among the rich billionaires who are ruining the earth, and I think planning to leave it, these colonies they're going to have on the moon and Mars and so on. I mean, can you imagine life on Mars? What kind of a life would that be? The human body, I don't think, thrives. They've seen that with these space, when they send people into space for a long time. It's pretty hard on the body. But this idea that we are just minds is very seductive. And I think that it's a very important thing to try to get people to just reflect on that. Think about that. Is that really what's going on? Because then that opens us more to feeling of, oh gosh, the natural world here, we had better take better care of it because it's the basis of our lives.
Yeah, and I think maybe to add a point to that, right? Like this technological drive, like one other illustration that people sometimes mention has to do with like uploading one's mind, through sort of like, the technologies like AI, and, that's just, a further example, I suppose, of what you already mentioned.
Yes, right, because apparently these billionaires are really keen on that their magnificent contents of their brains are going to be uploaded to someplace in the cloud somewhere, and their bodies cryogenically frozen, and my God, they'll be they'll be with us forever. But this is another thing. Is that I think it goes with interconnectedness. When you look at Buddhism and Taoism and especially the Chinese tradition, the finitude, the impermanence of everything is central. And when it comes to my impermanence, I think that's a big thing, that we've managed to shunt our demise, our death off into the corner. We simply don't see it much in society anymore. To reflect on our impermanence isn't a gruesome thing or morbid or whatever. It's getting a sense of reality, and if you get it right, then it's something to celebrate. There's a source of joy there to be found.
And so maybe shifting topic a little bit. So I've actually been reading also about and having a class about like the canon of Western philosophy. And one of the things that get mentioned there is also that, certain topics such as the philosophy of education have not really been part of this canon. And that made me sort of think about something that you discuss, right? Which I think has to do with sort of philosophy of education, which is namely, how do we raise political leaders sort of to be, good leaders, right? And what type of curriculum, what type of education would be required in order to make that happen, right? And I think in general, many people would say our political leaders have failed to deal with this type of crisis, right? So the education question seems to be of great importance and of great urgency. So here you compare like Confucian and Platonic political philosophy. And I think this is a question maybe that's not asked enough, namely, how do we raise good political leaders, and how is that grounded into a specific philosophy? So yeah, maybe you could help us there.
Right. Well, I'll try. Yes, and I think that the question of education in general, and people do talk about, we have to educate our children environmentally and to sort of understand where they are, is an important one. And I think that when you look at Confucius and Plato on educating the people you would like to be in charge of the polity, then it's not just them. I mean, that would be an education for the good human being as well. And yeah, what interests me is, I mean, there are so many parallels between Confucian political philosophy and the philosophy we find in Plato's Republic. And one of them is the education of the leaders, because how are we going to get these leaders to be the most competent? They've got to understand the situation, and the most competent to govern, and also the most virtuous in the sense of being selfless, governing for the sake of the governed rather than for their own sake. And I mean, this you can see that. I mean, Donald Trump was the anti-philosopher king. He was the total opposite of that, governing only for his own benefit and the benefit of his family. Well, but how do you do that? Because obviously it's good if the people in charge are thinking of the well-being of the whole polity rather than just a small section of it. Now, what's remarkable is that Confucius and Plato have similar ideas about how the education should work. It should really be twofold, they say. In the Republic, it's gymnastics in order to strengthen the body and develop virtues like courage and so on, and music. They have to be listening to the right kind of music, and music then in both cases, included poetry. For the Confucians, the two most important arts are music, and corresponding to gymnastics is what we might call ritual propriety. That is, how you behave towards your fellow human beings came primarily from in ritual situations, but also extend that out to generally the mores that govern a society and how we comport ourselves, and it's grounded for the Confucians in the body, in training the body in to move in certain ways. And I noticed that in the US there was a phase where they had physical education programs in schools, but they were too expensive, so they phased those out. So you lost that side of it. How much music is taught in the schools these days? In the US, not very much, I don't think. And what's interesting to me is also that neither of them is saying you've got to educate the leaders in statecraft. You know, they have to know politics and so on. The idea is much deeper and broader. You have to educate them to be real human beings, the best human beings that they can be, and that extends out into through the training of the body in the context of the natural world, and the music, because there's a sort of, in both cases, there's a rather, some people might dismiss it as mystical philosophy behind it, but there's an idea that the music is everywhere, that there's something about the world, the universe, that's musical, and that it's somehow works on vibrations or tones or something, not ones that we hear. And so the idea is that the ruler would be, through education in music and physical activity, would be in harmony as a person, as a body, with the body of the universe, with the body of the world. And that's something that after Plato we pretty much lost in the Western tradition of political philosophy. And I think it was a major loss. The Chinese never lost it. And it's the idea that any governing, that any political leadership takes place within the larger context of the powers of heaven and earth, within the larger context of the physical universe. Because if you look at Western political philosophy after the ancient Greeks, that's not really, it's as if society or the polity were encapsulated and were sort of, again, independent of other things. Whereas started with the emperor having to, in China, having to perform the right rituals according to the time of year and how the harvesting or the agriculture was going, that the Chinese never lost the notion that the political leadership has to take into account the largest context of the natural world. And if that had been the case in the West, again, I think we wouldn't be in the situation that we're in with the climate emergency, that we lost that notion of the broader picture to me.
Yeah, and I think maybe, one big topic within education, and I guess, for the last few decades, right, has been really also about specialization. And in some sense, this bringing up, good political leaders seems to be, for me, a cry against this type of specialization and really returning much more to the broader sense of being human.
But you're right, it's too specialized. And I think it's interesting that this hangs together with the question of the demise of the liberal education. I mean, I'm old enough to have undergone an education where people were proud to say, the teachers, okay, you're learning Latin and Greek. What use is that in your life? Well, not really very much, but that's the point. You're learning how to learn. It's not that you're learning any particular content or stuff. And it seems to me nowadays, when jobs disappear, I mean, whole professions sort of aren't there next week because of technological innovation, seems to be more and more important not to educate people in specific skills, but rather, if you have universities, have them educate people to be citizens and to be human beings, rather, and who know how to learn something if they had to learn something different, and who have a somewhat broader view than the specialization that's the bane of so much of life today.
And maybe returning again to sort of the question of like political identities, and especially how we want to carve that out, because already a few times I think you referred right to this idea of being part of like the broader world, even if we think about let's say the polis or like a nation from sort of a political entity perspective, and still maybe driving this idea and trying to understand it, right? Because to many people it might sound strange that when sort of the Confucian political philosophy says that the whole world is the ultimate political entity, like people might say, well, do we have to think about a world government, or what does that mean? So yeah, like what does that really mean?
Yeah, right. I mean, that goes back to the point where I said that the Chinese would say we had it backwards, that they're not starting in the right place. And it's I'm not going to be able to say much that's convincing on this, I'm afraid, because it's a really big issue. But this, let me take a concrete example, and I think because the idea, I mean, the Chinese call it 天下, all under heaven and all under the heavens. And what that means is the physical universe, culture, history, institutions, everything, all under the heaven. Just to make a stab at it, look at where we are with the United Nations. There have been now 26 of those, and I've followed them all. I'm old enough to have been there. Been there on the sidelines. I followed them all. 26 years, annual meetings of the UN to discuss the climate and what are we going to do about it. COP26 in Glasgow at the end of last year, another resounding failure. Basically every time, what do we get from it? Politicians saying, we understand there's a problem. Let's talk about it some more. Let's meet again next year. We'll talk some more. It's clearly not working. And I think a major reason it's not working is structural or systemic, because when you have, since this idea, the Westphalian notion of how interstate relations work and so on, the conditions today and how the United Nations understand themselves, that just as we individuals might come together optimally and form a social group and a society and a polity, well, nation states operate the same way. That like individuals, they're separate, they're autonomous, they're independent, and of course they're not, but that's the fantasy. And they come together in the United Nations on a yearly basis and say, how are we going to tackle this problem? And of course, they're all looking out for their own interests, for their national interests. But if individualism is an abstraction, and if individualism doesn't really work very well, I mean, I'm not talking about the truth value of these philosophies. I'm talking about the pragmatic effects of them. And if individualism has brought us to the state we're in now, I think there's something about it that's not working very well. And basically, the United Nations are 197, however many there are, individual nation states coming together and trying to agree on something where, as in the social contract, they would have to give up certain things. They would have to give up certain freedoms or certain advantages in order for the sake of the common good. And we could have some sort of subcommittee in the UN on dealing with climate that would come together, that would see it the other way around and say, look, we're all in this together. We're on planet Earth. The planet is burning. How do we fix this? How can we negotiate together, not with the primary thing being my nation state, has to come out of this the best, but rather, how can we talk with the idea of aiming for the common good or avoiding the common disaster, because unless we can do something about this soon, it's going to be, we won't even have nations to be united anymore. So yeah, sorry, I haven't had the opportunity to think enough about this, but that would be a concrete way of trying to turn our perspective around a bit. And so thinking locally more, especially with food production. We haven't talked about that, but one of the big things is the global food system and its dependence on cycling nutrients through animals before they get to our stomachs. Incredibly wasteful and making a huge contribution to greenhouse gases. But it's insane to have much of your food, maybe some of it is okay, but much of it come from halfway around the world. And we haven't mentioned colonialism either, but a lot of it is, many of our problems here with the climate go back, of course, to colonialism and imperialism, where the Western powers said, the European powers said, no, you're not going to grow your own food anymore. You're going to grow rubber trees and, we'll bring you some food every now and again, but that destruction of cultures and their food has enormous repercussions. So I think these are areas in which thinking, I mean, acting more and localizing things and getting a sense of place, it is, I think, the way to go to improve things.